Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to learn all of managerial economics in about an hour. I know the final isn't weighted evenly, but we're going to go through the whole course and cover everything. Okay, so starting off nice and simple, positive versus normative statements. Positive, these are things that can be tested, the things that you say something about the environment, versus normative are subjective claims. Look for things like should, could, I should go eat steak would be an example of that. Okay, so supply and demand. At the intersection of those two, we have our equilibrium, also called as a market clearing price, where everything that wants to be bought and everything that wants to be sold happens. So it clears the market. Demand's going to be downward sloping, supply's going to be upward sloping. Little review from micro there. And just keep in mind that there's a difference between quantity demanded and demand, and quantity demanded and supply. So there's a difference between the actual function and then what is happening. And then once supply equals demand, so you're at equilibrium. And this is where they intersect. And just one thing to keep in mind is the changes of demand. So like technology preferences, those things, those shift the demand curve, versus a change in price just moves along the demand curve. And similar things for supply. So changing that price moves along the supply curve. Changing things like price of substitutes, complements, technology, those actually adjust the actual curve and move it left or right. So how do we make things? This is done through the input of capital and labor. So we take this, put it together through this function, and then we have a certain output. And these output functions can vary in terms of styles. Some can be linear, some can be exponential, whatever it is. But we take these inputs, capital and labor, and then we have put it through this little factory, and then we get output, which is quantity. And labor, this example of like time, people, human capital, and in the short run, this is going to be a variable. And two things kind of to note with labor is if you take your entire quantity and divide it by the labor used, you get your average product of labor, so the average amount of product you make per labor. And then if you take the derivative of quantity with respect to labor, that function, then you get your marginal product of labor. And this is basically saying like, okay, with each additional labor unit, how much more quantity are you getting? On the flip side is capital. In the short run, this is fixed, so you can't change it, but then in the long run, it's going to be adjustable. And then one thing to keep in mind is the law of diminishing marginal returns. So if I'm a applesauce producer, I take in apples, I use up these productive resources, but then the more I make, the more apples I need to use because they're getting rotten, they're getting moldy. So by increasing one output, it causes kind of the other increases, or the other increase in output to diminish as we kind of get further along. So then we have returns to scales. So essentially, there's different types. So there's increasing, constant, and decreasing. So if I were to take all the inputs and double them, if my output more than doubles, then we have increasing returns to scales. If it doubles exactly, we have constant. If I take all the inputs, times them all by 2, but I get less than double the output, that's going to be decreasing returns to scale. And then two types of costs to note. One is opportunity cost. So this is essentially the cost of the next best foregone option. And this is what is mainly used in economics to evaluate opportunities. And is not necessarily just the explicit cost, but also the implicit cost of, let's say, what you could have used that land for. You have to take that in consideration. And on the flip side are sunk costs. So these are costs that have happened in the past and that aren't recoverable. So if this cost has already happened and you can't recover it, you can't sell off that land, you can't do something else with it, it's sunk cost. And essentially just don't worry about that. As Bob Marley likes to say, don't worry about a thing, because every little thing is going to be all right. So that's what you have to think about for sunk costs. And then here's just a quick kind of example of what it looks like in terms of the actual cost curve, just to visualize the increasing, decreasing, and constant returns to scale. And then similarly, but a little different, because this is now talking about cost in terms of economies of scale. So now if our output rises and our average cost falls, then we have economies of scale, which means we want to kind of go get bigger because we have less costs. And then if the cost, kind of the average cost stays the same, then we have constant costs. And then if it rises, then we have decreasing costs. Okay, elasticity. You're kind of looking at the slope. Or different types of slopes, but essentially you're just looking at how the impact of changing one factor affects the change in another factor. So how sensitive is demand to change in prices? So if we increase price by this percentage, how much percentage will quantity demanded vary. If something is less elastic, that means that it won't vary as much, versus if it's more elastic, that means that if we switch price a lot, it's super sensitive, so it'll change a lot. And there's two different formulas for this. The one, which is the point form, so if you're given a specific point, you have to find the price and quantity, and then with that, you do price over quantity times the derivative or the slope of that equation, and that'll give you that elasticity, versus if it's over a range, so if it's from X to Y, you're going to have a little bit more complicated formula, but you're going to take the change in quantity divided by the change in price, and then you're going to times that by the average price. So price 1, price 2 added together divided by 2 over the average quantity. So quantity 1, quantity 2 added together divided by 2. And that's going to give you your arc elasticity formula to calculate that elasticity. And if it's greater than 1, then you have elastic demand, and this is the absolute value for demand. Elasticity is going to be negative. If it's less than the absolute value of 1, then you have inelastic demand. And just kind of keeping those reference numbers between kind of perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, between infinity and 0. Okay, and as you move along a demand curve, you change your elasticity. So kind of as you get higher, if you think about as price becomes higher, you get more and more elastic, versus when price is lower, it's less elastic, so it's more inelastic. And then somewhere in the middle, you have your perfectly unitary, or your unitary elastic, which is equal to 1. So just kind of keep that in mind of as you get more price, more elastic. Okay, and then really quickly, some quick stats review, because that's a little bit important. But when you're looking into calculating this demand curve, you want to look into the best fit line, which minimizes the sum of squared errors. And this is basically like the squared error is your estimated point compared to the actual data point. And then the t-statistic, which is essentially calculated from the coefficient divided by the standard error. And a larger t-stat means that it's more probable, or have a higher likelihood of actually happening. And if it's larger than 2, it's statistically significant. And then keep in mind that just because we have this large correlation between two things doesn't mean that one thing causes the other. There can be a numerous amount of other factors that keep in mind. So just because there are more shark attacks when ice cream sales go up doesn't mean that ice cream sales cause shark attacks. And then if we were to change the data, bring it closer together, that'll improve our R-squared, which is just a way of kind of looking at how useful the model is in a simple form. All right, let's make some money. If we want to maximize revenue, we're going to set, we're going to kind of want to operate where our marginal revenue is equal to 0. Anywhere past that, we're going to be losing money for the most part of production. But if we want to maximize profit, this is kind of the holy grail of everything. We take it where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So the derivatives of cost equals the derivative of revenue. This is like the holy grail equation. Keep this in mind for almost all questions. If you have to figure out something, you're going to be using this equation. So just keep that in mind. That's how you're going to maximize profit. And then in the short run, a shutdown rule is if your average variable cost is higher than price, you're going to want to shut down. But then in the long run, you also have to take into consideration your fixed costs, because now they're avoidable. So if your average total cost is greater than price, you're going to want to shut down and exit the market, because you're going to be losing money. And one thing to keep in mind is if there are kind of recoverable costs, what I would suggest is just computing the total profit you would get from staying within the market and the total profit you would get from exiting the market, and go about that way, just to better understand that. So the first model we're looking at is perfect competition. This is one where there's lots of firms, there's lots of buyers, everyone's a price taker, everyone has full info, and there's free entry and exit. So you can enter the market, leave the market. Everything's the same essentially. And in this model, our kind of operating price is going to be where price equals marginal revenue. We operate where price equals marginal revenue, because if not, other firms could enter the market and capture that price. And we're assuming in this competition that all firms have the same marginal cost. So in perfect competition, our price equals our marginal revenue, which equals our marginal cost. Okay, so within the long run, we know that no firm is going to be making a profit, which means their average cost is also going to be equaling the price. And so if you need to kind of calculate where they're going to be operating and you're just given the cost function, you can find the marginal cost and the average cost, set those equal to each other, and then you can figure out the quantity that you're going to be producing at. And so in the short run, there's a chance they could be making profit, but then firms are going to enter this market because they can, and then it's going to drive up quantity, which will make sure that everyone's getting zero profit. And then there's consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus, you're looking at the difference between that P intersection and then the price at the quantity, kind of that little triangle. And then for producer surplus, it's almost the opposite. So it's the marginal cost up to the price and then the quantity. And just one thing to keep in mind is that profit is going to be producer surplus minus fixed cost. If there are no fixed costs, profit equals producer surplus. And you're maximizing your total surplus, which is good for everyone, at equilibrium. All right, my favorite cartoon character, Monopoly, the other type of model. This is one where there's only one singular supplier, Mr. Monopoly over here. And he has all that green cash because he's making a whole lot of profit. There's no substitutes, people can't switch, and there's a few barriers to enter. One of them could be natural, which means that it's like a expensive thing to get into. Expensive or large, high fixed cost is a natural barrier to enter. And then in order to kind of calculate where you're going to operate, you get your demand function, and then you're going to calculate your MR, which is essentially just double the slope with the same intercept, and then you set that equal to the monopoly's marginal cost. And that is going to be where demand is elastic. Because if demand wasn't elastic, you could increase price and get more money in terms of the quantity reduced. So monopolies will always be producing where demand is elastic on kind of that upper end of the demand curve. And what monopolies do, just like how I play Monopoly, is rob the bank as much as I can when no one's looking. And essentially what that does is by charging a higher price, then there's less quantity within the market, which means there's this thing called deadweight loss because we're not at that optimal, perfect competition quantity. And then monopolies can charge one price for everyone, but they can also do this thing called non-uniform price. They can do this if they have market power, they can identify different types of consumers, and they can limit the resale. So I can't sell to Patrick for undercutting the monopoly price. Otherwise, that wouldn't allow for non-uniform pricing. So what type of this non-uniform pricing can we do? Well, one is individual. So I go up to different people. I say, hey, how much would you pay for this clicker? They say, oh, I don't know, maybe like $10. I'll be like, okay, $10. Go up to the next person. They say, oh, how much would you pay? Oh, $8. I sell it to them. And I'm selling, this is perfect individual price discrimination, but I'm selling to everyone's maximum willingness to pay. And what that does is I take all of this consumer surplus and it's now all mine. So I have all the surplus within this market. It's less common, so sometimes you might be able to differentiate between groups, like between age, student, location, and you can also have self-selected discrimination. So this is things like coupons or premium, pro, starter plans. People can self-select based on their willingness to pay. Another form is nonlinear. So you're basing the price on quantity. So if you buy one pair of socks, it'll be $20. If you buy two pairs, it'll be $35, and so on. You can kind of have these different bundles. Or not different bundles, but kind of these different prices as you buy more quantity. And just one thing to keep in mind is you're kind of calculating what's the average cost for each of those products as you kind of go along the line. And they're going to be doing that to trying to take as much consumer surplus as possible. And then the other part is two-part pricing. So just like Costco, they say, hey, give me money each year for this membership. So you get that membership, that's your access fee. Now you can enter the stores, and then in the stores they say, okay, give me more money for food. So you have your access fee, and then you also have your cost, your per unit cost as well. So for this two-part pricing, if you have identical consumers, so everyone has the same willingness to pay, what you're going to do is you're going to calculate what the consumer surplus would be at, or what the total surplus would be at the perfectly competitive price. So you kind of calculate, okay, what's the quantity at the perfectly competitive price? You calculate what that surplus would be, the consumer surplus at that quantity would be, and then you're essentially going to set your access price equal to that and take all of that consumer surplus. So whatever they would have gained for being along that demand curve, you're going to set the access price to that, and then you're going to set your the per unit price equal to the marginal cost. So find out where quantity is for perfect competition, find out what that consumer surplus is, and then you're going to set your access fee equal to that. But if you have different customers, it's a little bit trickier. You can't necessarily determine the exact point or the exact price that you're going to set it at, but it'll be someplace above marginal cost. So for different consumers that have different preferences, different demand curves, your price per unit is going to be somewhere above marginal cost, and then your access fee will be slightly lower. than it would be if you just had one identical consumer. So we're moving on now to bundling. It's getting cold out. Make sure you stay bundled up. There's a few different types. Pure means that the only thing that is available is the bundle. So you only want people to purchase the bundle, which is mixed when you have different types of consumers. You want some to purchase the bundle and then others to purchase the actual individual items. And pure bundling is best for preferences or people who have very strong negative correlation between their preferences. So one person values this really high, the other person values this really low, and then they switch. You combine those two willingness to pays to calculate your bundle price and then sell it to them. Those are when it works best. And one thing to keep in mind with all of bundling is a lot of it is just a trial and error game. You really just have to go through, calculate, okay, what would I be making with pure bundling, with mixed bundling, with no bundling, who would be buying it, and then just doing those calculations. Your marginal cost is normally 0, which makes things super easy. And then with mixed bundling, again, you're going to want to, the people who have those strong negatively correlated prices to purchase the bundle, and then the other people you're going to set a very high price or their maximum price. So then when they're buying that individual product, you're extracting as much surplus as possible from those consumer groups. But it is a lot of trial and error. So you just have to go through, figure out what you would be making, who would actually be buying it, and ensure that you set the quantity or the price high enough that someone can't just buy 2 items cheaper than they could buy the bundle. So just make sure to keep that in mind. And then the other type of pricing is peak load. So like a ski resort or a summer vacation, they have different demands depending on the season. And so what you're going to want to do is just set your marginal revenue for each of these seasons equal to your marginal cost, and that'll kind of figure out your quantity. But oftentimes there's a capacity constraint. So if you do that, but then during your peak season, you hit that capacity constraint, you're more than it, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to set your quantity, like the quantity demanded, equal to your capacity constraint, and then solve for price. So that's what you would do if you hit the capacity constraint. And if it is hit, consider increasing your capacity. All right, so we're done with monopoly. Now we got 2 monopoly men or more, oligopoly. This is a few sellers within the market, and they can be identical or differentiated products, and unfortunately they are a bit more complex, but we'll get into them. The first oligopoly is cartels. So these are things that where they kind of artificially reduce quantities to increase the price up to the monopoly level, so they can kind of take all of that profit. And some things with cartels to keep in mind is, one, that if they're trying to collude, that's most of the time illegal, which is why cartels normally fail. But then also there's incentive to cheat. So if I'm in a cartel and I produce a little bit more than my opponent, I take more money, or I undercut him, so I take more profit. And that kind of battles it down, which kind of keeps cartels in check. But if you can detect who's cheating, so if I can detect if someone's cheating, that'll probably prop up and keep the cartel going for a long time. And just kind of looking here on the graph, we kind of see the difference between monopoly, that's up there with a lower quantity, and then as we go down between the models, we get more and more quantity up until the perfect competition quantity, which is all the way on the other side. Okay, so that's cartels. Now we go to Corno. This is firms that, for the most part, have the same marginal cost. They have identical products, and then they have to decide simultaneously how much to produce. So this is something where you need to know production beforehand, and how the best way to go about solving this is, so you have your your demand equation, and you have your 2 different quantities, and then you're going to calculate your revenue for one firm by multiplying by the quantity. So price times quantity is going to equal revenue. So that's where we have our total revenue graph equation. And then once you get that, you're going to differentiate with respect to that firm's quantity, and that'll give you the marginal revenue for that firm. And then you kind of set that equal to your marginal cost to find the best response function for that firm. And then once you have that, if they have the same marginal cost, you know that it's identical, which means that Q1 will equal Q2, and you can sub that into the equation to solve for your Q1 quantity. And then once you have that, you're going to put that back into your price equation, figure out what the price of the market would be, and now you've solved the Corno equilibrium. So keep in mind, you want to set it up where you have your big queue broken down into the two smaller queues, multiply by one of the firms to get their revenue, differentiate that to get their marginal revenue, and then set it equal to marginal cost, and solve that kind of intersection. And one thing to keep in mind is as we add more and more firms, as n gets larger, we're going to have a cheaper price and more quantity, and we're going to approach the perfectly competitive level up until infinite amount of firms. So here you can see our two different best response functions, and then where they intersect is where you're going to want to produce. So that's Cornell. But what if we were selling something different? So this is what we call Bertrand, or what I like to call Bertram from Hey Jesse. So for the Bertram identical product market, we now have identical products, but we set prices simultaneously as opposed to quantities. So it's super easy to change our price. We're just like, oh, this is $5, boom, quick change it to $4, $3, whatever it wants. It's super easy, and our quantity doesn't have to be determined beforehand. So how this is gonna look is, if you imagine I was up against these 4 kids selling lemonade right beside them, and they had their cups of lemonade, I had my cups of lemonade, they priced it for $2. I'm gonna come in there, I'm gonna say, buy my lemonade, it's the exact same thing, but $1.99. They're gonna look at me and say, whoa, what are you doing? They're gonna price it for $1.90. And we're gonna keep battling it out, undercutting each other until we get to our marginal cost, until we can't go any lower. And so what happens is that it ends up being the exact same as perfectly competitive or perfect competition markets, because we're producing at our marginal cost, because otherwise the other firm would just undercut and take the entire market, since they are the same products. So unfortunately, my lemonade business is not going to make any money. But now I'm selling pink lemonade. So now we have a little differentiated product. So now we can set our prices a little bit higher than marginal cost, but we don't know exactly how much higher. We can't really calculate that. All you need to know is that you'll set it a bit higher than marginal cost if it is differentiated. And just like Bertram, I don't know, I just like him, he's cool. So if you have differentiated products, your best response curves will be a little bit different, and you can set price higher than marginal cost as opposed to equal to marginal cost, which is what you would do with identical products. Okay, so that's oligopoly. Now, monopolistic competition, essentially almost the same thing as perfect competition. The only thing to keep in mind is that rather than being free entry and exit, it's easy, and then products are a little bit differentiated, which means that you can kind of set prices above marginal cost without losing all customers right away. And you're going to be kind of setting but then more firms will kind of enter the market and kind of drive profits down as that short run turns into the long run. This is because more firms enter and take away kind of that profit. All right, game theory. If anyone's watched the game theory, there's a cool like outro, like, but hey, that's just a theory, game theory. So one big assumption that we make is that people are rational. They think a lot. I know that you know that I know that you know, that whole thing. So that's one thing to just keep in mind, that people will know different information, and people want to maximize, for the most part, if they are rational, their payoff. So how much money am I getting, or how much money am I losing? And then these games could be played after another or just once. And one thing to keep in mind with these game theory, these strategies, is there's a dominant strategy. If no matter what you do, I'm going to do this thing. So no matter what you do, if I do the exact same thing, that's a dominant strategy. It doesn't matter what you do, I'm going to do the same thing. That's a dominant strategy. And then for a prisoner's dilemma to happen, there has to be a dominant strategy solution. So both people have to have this dominant strategy, what they would want to do. But there exists another outcome that will give us both higher payoffs. So this is the prisoner's dilemma, where I want, how it goes is, I want to rat you out and you want to rat me out, and then we both lose, as opposed to both cooperating, because we both have dominant strategies and there's a solution outside of that equilibrium that gives us both better outcomes. So that's the definition of prisoner's dilemma. Okay, now Nash equilibrium can be a little confusing, but how I like to approach it is, you basically are taking it from two different sides. So from one side, I'm going to say, okay, what if this player plays left? What is my response going to be? And then you consider, okay, if this player plays right, what is my response going to be? So you take those, you kind of write down those matchups, and then you take it from the other side. Okay, if this player plays right, what am I going to do? If this player plays left, what am I going to do? So you take all kind of those 4 combinations, and then you see, do any of those combinations match up? Where if I'm playing right, if I'm playing right, they want to play left, and if they're playing left, I want to play right. If any of those combinations match up, boom, that's a Nash equilibrium. Sometimes there can be one of them, sometimes there can be multiple of them, and sometimes you can kind of have this weird thing where you flip-flop between with mixed equilibriums. But that's essentially how you approach it, how you determine whether or not there is a Nash equilibrium, is taking it from each side and then seeing if those combinations actually match up. It's oftentimes saying, like, if you can't improve your situation based on the choice of the other player. So we kind of go through this example here in the slides if you wanted to look into a bit more into it, of where they end up in a position where no firm could change one choice to be better off based in the scenario that they're in. So you can have multiple equilibria. So this is where there's kind of 2 possible scenarios that we could end up in, and one we could maybe discuss beforehand called cheap talk of, like, hey, I think that we should pick this because we should. But there's always a risk that if you're doing that, the other person's going to be like, oh yeah, yeah, for sure, I'll do that. But then they backstab you, and then they pick the one that's going to give them the higher payoff. So that's why it's called cheap talk, because might be able to talk the talk, but you might not walk the walk. So that's cheap talk. And then the Pareto criterion is basically where they have multiple equilibria, but then one of them gives both firms a better payoff than the other one. And then due to the Pareto criteria, both firms will kind of select that one because it's better off for them. So then it's better off for both of them. And then that's what happens. So that's Pareto criterion. Okay, and then mixed strategies, essentially, these are coming in where someone picks between options based on a certain probability, and that probability essentially has to make it so that the other player is indifferent between their options. So that probability will make it so the other player's expected value between their 2 options is equal. So if you're given a question where it says, is this probability going to have a mixed strategy equilibrium, you have to calculate, okay, what would be the other player's expected value between the 2, and it has to be indifferent, so it has to be equal between those 2 options. And sometimes you can have pure strategy and mixed together, but just keep in mind that you want the other player to be indifferent between the 2 strategies in order for it to be a mixed strategy equilibrium. And you calculate that based on having the same expected value using the multiplication with the probability. And so sometimes you can kind of have the same here. So we have mixed and pure strategy equilibria together here. And we kind of have multiple Nash equilibriums. And then you'd be given kind of that probability that would make it indifferent between choosing the 2. Okay. But what happens if I don't know that you know, or maybe I don't trust you that you know? So this is where we get into rationality. And sometimes what we would expect to be the best thing due to these expected payoffs doesn't actually happen because people are risk adverse, or they're scared that you're going to do something else. You're scared that someone is going to do something that's going to hurt you a lot. And that's where, yes, we can calculate all this in theory, but then in actuality, if people aren't rational, they might do something completely different. And then another thing is information. So I might not know for sure what your payoff for one of these things would be, or I might not know for sure what you're going to do. So then I don't have complete information, so my choice isn't as good as it would be, and it might be different than it would be in theory. So since the payoffs aren't public information, people don't know what the Nash equilibrium would be, and they don't want to lose out on that minus 20, so they end up not investing. And it just kind of gets a bit more tricky, where you just have to keep in mind that not everyone's going to be rational, and not all information is going to be known. And then because of this, some people will approach, okay, how can I minimize my loss possible? And this is called the maximum solution. So essentially you say, okay, which choice can I make that will maximize or minimize the loss that I will be making? So your maximum minimum payoff. That's why it's called maximin. So essentially you kind of find the minimum payoff for each of your choices, and then find the one that's the highest between the minimum payoff of there. And then what happens if both firms approach this strategy? Then you have the maximum solution, which might not be the best solution for both of them, but it's the one where they are most risk averse. Okay, so that's what happens if we do it once, kind of this static. But for dynamic games, multiple times, you kind of go back and forth, and you have a turn, another turn, another turn. So you have these actions, and then combine those together, you have an overall strategy. And there's different strategies that you can do. One is imagine like a 6-year-old kid that's just really mad, really upset, gets into a temper tantrum. If you piss him off, he's gonna be mad for the rest of life. So if you pick a choice that hurts them, so they're gonna start off playing a good strategy, but then if you kind of punish them, then that little kid is just gonna punish you for the rest of the terms. They're always gonna pick the one that'll kind of give you the lowest outcome. So that's kind of the trigger strategy. Whereas the tit for tat is a more mature, calm, zen person. They're just gonna say, I'm gonna start off high, I'm gonna start off nice, and then I'm just gonna follow what you do. So copy your move from the previous round. And that's tit for tat. You do this, I'll do that next. You do this, I'll do that next. And sometimes that can equal into equilibrium if they both approach that strategy. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we move into Stackelberg, which is similar to where you decide on your quantities, but now it's in a sequential way. And the way you approach this is you have your leader, they pick first, and then your follower, they pick second. But to evaluate it, you're actually going to do the reverse. So you're going to look at the follower. You're going to say, okay, follower, if I'm the follower and the leader does this, what am I going to choose? If I'm the follower and the leader picks the middle option, what am I going to choose? If I'm the follower and for the last one. And then so you have these list of 3 outcomes based on what the leader would do. And then the leader is going to look at that and they're going to say, okay, I know the follower is going to do this and this and this. Which of those choices gives me the highest outcome, knowing that the follower is going to do that strategy? And then that's going to kind of end up being that solution for the Stackelberg game. Because the leader wants to maximize its profit based on what it knows the follower is going to do. And this, as you can see here, is illustrated by the green path, because the follower, it's yellow, picks its best options regardless of what the leader does. And then the leader says, okay, I don't want 2, I don't want 5, I want 12. I'm going to pick that one. And that's going to be the solution for this one. And then these are just kind of showing that, okay, all of these different solutions, so like if they were to go to 20 and 10, these are all kind of sub-game perfect. So just like the combination of this equals that sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. What if I say, oh, if you pick this, oh, I'm going to pick something that's going to give you nothing. Well, these are threats, and sometimes they can be credible and sometimes they're not. Credible threats, essentially, one can be done by you actually doing it. So if you do the threat, you act, that kind of shows credibility. But then if not, if you go at the same time or once, you wouldn't make a threat which would give you a lower payoff than it would of not doing the threat, because that just wouldn't make sense to you. So a threat won't be credible if I say, oh, I'm going to pick the solution that gives us none, if I could pick the solution that gives me 5, because that's just not credible unless I actually do it and I'm irrational. And then so another thing to keep in mind is entry deterrence. So essentially there's a few different ways to kind of block someone from entering. One is it's like too much of a commitment to enter, or by entering, they have to invest a lot, and that investment is going to be greater than their profit. So if F is greater than 4, the second player, move 2, isn't going to want to enter because they're just going to be losing money. So that's kind of the blockaded entry by having too high of that barrier to enter. And then another one could be deterred, is I like slip a 20 under the table and I say, hey, don't sell lemonade here. And you're like, okay, great. 20, that's pretty good. That's, more than I would be making if I were to enter. And so you agree to do it. And then I get to sell all the lemonade and I make money. And I would only do that if the difference between what I would make if you entering, so 10, versus what I would make if you are entering, if it's smaller than that. So in this case, if B is greater than 6, so if I had to slip you a 7, I wouldn't want to block you from entering, because then I would be losing out money instead of just letting you enter. And then lastly, if I'm super nice, I'm like, hey, please don't sell lemonade here. I worked my whole life selling lemonade here. And then you agree, that's kind of accommodated entry. So just kind of help me out. Or if you want to sell lemonade here, I can like, okay, sure, I'll be nice. And then another thing is just having pure scale. So everyone's favorite app, Temu, just can sell items at such a cheap rate because their marginal cost is just so low. They undercut the prices of everyone else, which makes it really hard to compete with them. This is another form of entry deterrence because they can just keep the prices so low, no one else can compete with them, because it's lower than the person who would enter's marginal cost. Okay, so the hold up problem is essentially saying, hey, you're gonna come to this place and make a really large investment, and then because you made that large investment, you're gonna wanna stick here, you wanna stay here, but then I can do something that'll jack up the price for you or take more money from you and try to maximize how much money I could take from you. And I like to think of it as, if I come in and say, hey, I wanna buy a private island. So Patrick will sell me this private island. I'm like, great, I just spent a whole bunch of money on this private island, that's great. But then I find out that the only way to get to this private island is for Patrick to drive me in a boat. And now Patrick, he knows that I spent a lot of money on this private island and I like my beaches. So I want to go to this private island. And Patrick knows this. So he's like, hey, rather than charging like $100 for a boat ride, I'm going to charge you like $1,000 per boat ride. He's going to jack up that price. And then I'm really sad because I still want to visit my private island, but now it costs a lot more. So this is kind of the hold up problem, the hold up scenario where someone takes advantage of this massive investment that someone made, and they jack up the price and earn more money from it. Or it could be similar where I buy a pizza oven, and then if they jack up the price, like my rent, so much that it's actually cheaper for me to kind of go somewhere else, then I'll just leave. So if Patrick starts charging me way too much money, you best believe I'm buying another private island. So what we learned from this is that I'm gonna have 2 private islands. Okay, so a few different types of behavioral games. This is a bit more into psychology aspect. Essentially, it's kind of thinking about what people will actually do as opposed to what the theory says. And one of them is, if you do something that's gonna insult me and that's gonna be greedy, and I don't like that, so I'm gonna pay you. I'm gonna make sure you get like eye for an eye. I'm gonna try to pay you back. So one of them is the ultimatum game, where it's like, you have a set amount of money, you can decide how much money you want to give to me, and then I have to accept it, and then we both get it, or I reject it, and then we both get nothing. So in theory, I should give just like $1 to you because that's better for you, and then I get everything. But once again, you're gonna be like, hey, that's insulting, that's greedy, I'm gonna screw you over, we both get nothing. So in reality, it's a bit different than how it would work in theory. And then another one is, oh, everyone guess a number, you'll get paid if you're 2/3 of the average value. And then everyone starts trying to think that they're super smart, like Einstein. So like, if everyone guesses randomly, 2/3 of 50, that'd be, okay, that'd be 33. So then if everyone's gonna guess that, then I'm gonna take 2/3 of that, and then it keeps going down and going down because everyone thinks they're smarter than the other person, and it kind of keeps going. And then the like Nash equilibrium of this would be where you guess 0 because it's just gonna kind of keep getting lower. But again, that kind of varies in practice, where people might overestimate or underestimate the intelligence of the other people in the game. Now it's time to teach you how to gamble. So there's these things called, yeah, now he's paying attention. Okay, so there's these things called a fair gamble, which basically means that the expected value of taking this gamble is 0. So if you did this a whole bunch of times, you wouldn't win anything, you wouldn't lose anything because it'll average out to 0. If someone is risk averse, they will not do a fair gamble. If they're risk neutral, they'll be like, I don't care. But if they're risk preferring, they will always choose to take this fair gamble. And you can kind of judge these risk curves based on this thing called utility, which basically like, how much enjoyment do you get from having a certain amount of money? So if I were to risk a certain amount of money, but I could win a lot of money, that's kind of judging the difference in utility. And one thing to keep in mind is most people will take small gambles, but won't want to do, will take these small gambles, but are a bit more averse in kind of these larger larger gambles just because it's so much money that they could be losing. And so if you have a linear risk curve or a utility curve, that means that it's risk neutral. If it's smiley face, so if it goes like this way, so it kind of curves upward, then they're going to be risk preferring. And then if it's concave, so kind of down, then it's going to be risk adverse, which we'll get to. Okay, so your expected utility of a gamble, basically similar to expected value, just with one more extra step, because why not? So you're going to have your gamble, two outcomes of your wealth. You're going to take the outcome of this wealth, apply a formula to it. That's your utility formula. Multiply that by the probability of this outcome. Do that with the other outcome. You take your wealth in this outcome, put it through the utility function, multiply it by the probability. You add those two together, and then that's going to be your expected utility of this. So that's the expected utility of that gamble. And then if you take that combined expected utility and you put it through the reverse of the utility function, that's going to be your certainty equivalent. It's going to say, how much money would you rather have for sure than taking this gamble? And then the difference between the expected value or the expected value of your wealth and the certainty equivalent is going to be your risk premium. So just graphically, we're showing here. So again, this is the concave risk utility function. So this someone is risk adverse. The gamble line is below the curve here. And so if we look just on the curve here, so we know that this is where our wealth starts at. And then we could get our wealth to that level if we lose the gamble, or W4 if we win the gamble. And then we kind of go up to our utility function and say, okay, that's the utility of our wealth here. That's the utility of our wealth here. And then you take the difference between your expected value for a fair gamble, which would be 0, and then your certainty equivalent. And that gives you the risk premium, which is just kind of visualized on the graph here. And just one thing to kind of keep in mind here is your people who are risk adverse would rather have something for sure. People who are risk adverse have a risk premium because they would rather have a smaller value for sure than risking their wealth for something. And that's why there exists a risk premium, and you calculate that based on the expected value minus the certainty equivalent, which is like, okay, this gamble is worth this amount of enjoyment to me based on how we calculated it, but what amount of cash for sure is also worth that same amount of enjoyment to me? That's the certainty equivalent. Okay, so we learned about gambling. Now let's learn about insurance. Essentially, it's the opposite of gambling. Now, risk-adverse people would be willing to pay more than the fair value of insurance, kind of the opposite of their risk premium, because it protects their assets, because it helps them through losses. So if something is actually fair insurance, then the cost of the insurance is essentially going to be equal, or the price of the insurance is essentially going to be equal to the probability of something bad happening times the cost of that something bad happening. And then people who are risk adverse are going to want to pay more for that. And that's essentially how insurance companies make their money. And that's why they want to purchase it, to avoid these potential losses. Speaking of losses, there's a little potential clown here, but framing matters in how you kind of state losses and gains. And then so people are normally risk adverse when making choices involving gains, but then risk preferring make choices involving like avoiding losses. So depending on how you frame a certain question, even though mathematically it'll be the same, they'll make different decisions or different choices because of that. So if I could gamble to try to save a lot of people, save them from dying, I would want to do that. And it just kind of the psychology of how you state the phrase changes people's reaction to it, which is just important to note and keep in mind. And then similar to framing is the prospect theory, which basically says that $1 and $2 is a bigger difference than $1,001 and $1,002. So you kind of have this reference point. So here we have kind of gains on the top and losses on the bottom left. And then you see how the curves kind of flatten out. This is basically saying that as you kind of get more and more wealth or more and more losses, the difference between a $1 or $2 becomes less and less, because your reference point is much different. It's out of that steep range, and then your risk preferring kind of in the domain of losses, because you kind of see it's like the opposite concavity. Okay, last thing here is talking about moral hazard and adverse selection. So one is to do with a hidden action, so something that someone does that you can't see, and then the other thing is for hidden characteristics, so something that something has that you can't see. So let's say that I am selling mangoes, but they could be apples. You don't know that. Because or let's say you do know that. Then you have full information, you know what they are. So then the market fully clears, because you're gonna pay whatever you would pay for an apple, and you'd pay whatever you'd pay for a mango, and you know what you're getting. There's no risk into it. You'll pay that, everything will get sold, and it's a lovely day. But now, if the seller, they know what they're selling, but the buyer doesn't, then it gets a bit more complicated. And then the buyer has to evaluate their options. And what they're gonna do is they're like, what do I think the chances that this person's selling me an apple are? And what would I value an apple at? And then you're gonna multiply that probability by the probability that they're selling you a mango and the price that you would value a mango at. And then you add that together, and then that's gonna be your willingness to pay in this market. But the thing with adverse selection happens is, most of the time that willingness to pay is actually less than the cost of a mango, due to the way that the math works out. And if that willingness to pay is less than the cost of a mango, then no mangoes will get sold. Only the apples will get sold. The market isn't clear. People are upset because they don't get mangoes. The sellers are upset because they don't sell all their mangoes, and it's a bad day. And that's what happens with adverse selection. This is why it's inefficient, because not all of the mangoes are sold, and this is also what drives good quality products out of the market, because the sellers just won't accept such a low price for it, and the buyers aren't willing to risk paying a high price for a potentially bad product, and so it makes it inefficient. What can we do for this? Well, we could screen. So we could take this apple, cut a little slice, see if it's a mango or not. We could have these signals. So you might give a warranty saying, oh, trust, this is a mango. I certify that. You kind of try to inform the uninformed party. Or you could have a third party come in and verify and provide more information to kind of just help your decision, and then that'll drive up your willingness to pay. So let's say I took Insurance 101. I'm like, great, I want to get insurance. So I get life insurance, and then I'm like, whoa, I'm insured. I can do whatever I want now. So I go skydiving like a whole bunch of times. So that's me skydiving, because I bought life insurance, and this is what we call moral hazard. Is I'm insured. So what's the worst that can happen? They'll pay for me. So I changed my behavior to be more risky after a contract is made. And this is bad because they make a decision, and then it becomes more likely that they'll have to pay. So the outcomes become different. Or another example is you get insured when you are a bit less careful with your deep fryer when you're making those fries, because you make those twice a day because they're just so delicious. And then a few ways to kind of avoid this is you can have deductibles on your insurance. So you'd still have to pay a little bit amount, so it's not good for you to take the added risk. Or you can have incentive-based contracts. So you kind of get money or get paid more depending on kind of how you do. So I'm not gonna kind of not do much effort in work, because if I do more effort, I'll get paid more. So we have incentive contracts. Then another thing is monitoring. So if they just strap the camera on me, they could see how often I went skydiving, and then they might adjust the price of my insurance. So you can monitor how someone's gonna do. And the last thing is hostage. So essentially you like say, oh, you can do whatever you want, but if we discover that something happens, we're gonna take this from you. And if they take my mango from me, I won't be very happy. So this is just another example of how to deal with moral hazards. But that covers pretty much everything within the course. Please scan this QR code to give us feedback on how to make these sessions better. take a photo of it, scan it, fill it out. That would be amazing. Covered pretty much everything in around 50 minutes. And then just the last thing that I want to leave you with today on adverse selection is that good luck with the exam. And if someone's offering you a mango, you don't really know if it's a mango or a cake. So you don't know whether or not it's going to be worthwhile purchasing it. And that's just another example of adverse selection. So always be careful when you're buying those mangoes. Thank you all so much for coming. We hope you enjoyed, and best of luck on your exam. Yeah? Thank you.